and the next speaker is Maurice Paulissen. So he's a PhD student in the Cultural Geography group, and he will bring us to the history, which will tell something of the future, I guess.
Okay, thank you, yes, I would like to talk about my fascination for landscape history, a field of research that I think fits very well with what we do with Wageningen domains at this university. And I will present about my ongoing research on the history of man's interaction with peatlands, with raised bogs, Dutch Wageningen, in the Low Countries over the last couple of centuries. I will present briefly on the approach that I use in my research, and then I will look to some of the possible applications. So I'm working in the Cultural Geography group, and I'm part of a larger NWO-funded project called Home Tour, which is led by Dr. Roy van Beek. The past is a foreign country. That's the title of a 1985 book by the American historical geographer David Lowenthal. I think this phrase actually captures very well my fascination for landscape history. Because we all travel the Earth's surface on a regular basis, but I also travel in time. I'm a tourist in the past. The good thing is, I'm allowed to do this in working time. So here you see a 20,000 hectare near pristine raised bog in one of the Baltic states. And this would also be what a Dutch raised bog landscape looked like some 500 years ago. So why is it interesting to study bogs at all? Well, on this map you see a very conservative estimate of the peatland extent in the year 1500 AD. Now the dark spots are raised bogs. And here you can see what is left of that, mainly in Nature 2000 areas. And as at least Dutch of you will know, this is an important process that accounted for the loss of our raised bogs. Many bogs were bought by entrepreneurs who completely dug away the peat deposit, and it was used, actually, as some have said, to fuel the Dutch Golden Age. So by no means was this transformation, this peat extraction on a large scale, a marginal thing economically in post-medieval time. It was quite important. But on the other hand, we also have this very persistent cliché image of bogs as hostile, dangerous places that people avoided unless they really had to be there. So this tension is one of the triggers for my research, really. And the way I approach that is I look, on the one hand, to the physical landscape, and also the physical landscape of the past, because it looks differently now than it used to do. And I look to rural communities living close to these bog areas, and the way they perceive the landscape, and the possibility and limitations of the landscape for use. And then, given their economic needs and needs of survival, they chose, or were forced almost, to use these landscapes in a certain way. And both things, so the way people perceived the landscape and the way they used it, were reflected in cultural remains of all kinds that we can still find in many cases in present-day landscapes, even if the bogs themselves have gone. So think of field names, think of parcellation patterns, canals, even old places where houses and huts used to be on the bog. So what I should maybe say first is that what I try to do is I try to connect to current theoretical debates in science, and I apply different themes. I work with different themes that each connect to a different theoretical discourse. And the way I work is also could be called interdisciplinary, in the sense that I work with geographical and social theory, but I combine that with historical and archaeological methodology. And I think that fits quite well actually with my position as a landscape historian, with a background in ecology, but in the cultural geography group where we are mainly with social scientists. So let's have a closer look on one of the themes that I'm working on, which is raised bogs from a commons perspective. So let me first clarify some terms here. So until the 19th century, common land used to be very abundant in Europe. Those were lands that were owned or at least used collectively by groups of people that were entitled to do so, that we call commoners. And those commoners, they made a set of rules and regulations for the use of those common lands. And together, these commoners and their rules and regulations are also referred to, maybe a bit confusing, as commons or commons institutions. Now on the right hand side of the slide you see two, well, one at least very well known and the other rather well known among historians, works that come from the school of common pool resource theory. And this theory says a number of things. One of them is that commons institutions in the past used to be very autonomous in their action, if only because in late medieval time and beginning of the early modern period, both states and markets were not yet mature, were not yet fully developed, so they had to be. And another thing this theory stresses is that commercialization of goods taken from common land was a thing that didn't occur in general, or at least it was strictly prohibited. So my question for this theme was, how does this, to what degree does this match historical reality for raised bog landscapes in this part of the world? And so I went into dusty archives, looked for written evidence on the way these boglands were used, what problems people encountered, and how they solved them. And this is just one example of an area that I studied in the southeastern Netherlands, the village of Bakel. And actually this text says the following. It's a very simple register of volumes of peat that were exported from this village to the wider region. And that's interesting because that all resources taken from a common land should be used by those entitled only. So in this case that would mean that the communities that were entitled to use the Bagelse domain, so the common land of Bakel, and that was the village of Bakel itself, but also some neighboring communities, all the peat should stay there and should be used for home, heating homes and for home consumption. But when I worked through these archives for these 6 years only that I show here, I found the following pattern. Peat was actually systematically sold to places as far as 30 kilometers away. And this was by no means a thing that happened only in the early 17th century when those were really times of hardship, of course, in the 8 Years' War. And we know that also the village of Bakel was particularly hit, as were other places, but we also find that in the 18th century, then there was a important flow of peat to the city of Den Bosch, for example. Please, by the side, also note on this 17th century map the beautiful depiction of the bog landscape of the Pela. So you see a vast wetland, so it also gives you some feeling of how people viewed these landscapes at the time. So what do I want to gain from my research then? Well, first of all, I want to understand past solutions to past problems. And in the case that I presented, we saw that it was actually possible, apparently, to reconcile sustainable long-term management of common land resources with a degree and consistency of commercialization. Secondly, I'm interested in cultural remains in present-day landscapes for several reasons. Not only can cultural remains from the past inform us about the history and the genesis of landscapes, but also from the wider home turf project that I'm working in, we're interested in developing strategies to identify, to value, to use those cultural remains, for example, to enrich the present landscape, which is so badly under pressure of both not only biodiversity decline, but also decline of all kinds of cultural elements. And then thirdly, So how could we live in the present and prepare for the future without an understanding of the past? So I won't claim that past solutions can be used one-on-one to solve our present-day issues, but they can certainly inspire us and help us to go beyond the issues of today. So, to close my talk, the past is a foreign country, and I would like to add to that without landscape history, without history in general, we would certainly be strangers in the country we live in. Thanks for your attention.
Questions?
Anyone, please?
Can you tell us a little bit about these commons? Because you say that there were commoners in charge of the commons. A lot of discussion about the commons is about also about property rights and how they are distributed within certain groups of the population.
Yes, well, I think that's a diverse picture that you get. In medieval period, late medieval time, there was really a wave of actions by, for example, dukes and other lords to hand out common land, which they considered their own in medieval time, and the wilderness was the kings, and later the dukes that became more powerful. They would grant a right to use the land to villagers, who probably already used it by then, because it was quite empty land, of course, in medieval period. But I think the picture later on changes and also varies from place to place. I think there are examples where the common land, well, at least in the 19th century, when kind of modern-day municipalities appeared, those lands are municipal property, right? So, yeah, I find it hard also in this case, but I know the Wageningen was definitely granted. The right was granted to Wageningen initially, and the other communities they joined quite quickly. They bought themselves in to use this common land. Yeah. Is that an answer to your question?
And they all who did profit from selling the peat? Was that the whole community?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think it was necessarily the whole community. You see, it was just individual villagers that sell peat, and what I think, but I don't have full proof of that, is that they could just, they use the money to get. I call it a kind of a commercial survival economy. That's a term already coined earlier, but I think it fits also to this situation. That people, it was not really necessarily a big money economy, but certainly money was not unknown, definitely not, and people could probably, they took what they could get from that. And we know in this case it was really a very difficult time because the village was burned down, etc. in the 8 years war, so there was hardship, but the same went for other places. So there's a lot that I didn't tell about this case, but there was also internal conflict between those entitled. The other villages contested the selling of peat, so there's a much more complex thing.
How much was it very specific for that area in Brabant? So how can you translate that to other areas in the Netherlands or outside?
Yeah, that's a good question. This was one of two cases that I studied more in depth. The other case was in the Wageningen in Belgium, so let's say the southern Low Countries, which is a different area altogether, but we also find there in a bit different way. There was not so much people selling it to outsiders, but selling the peat to a paper mill. That was state-owned also, so that was another interesting twist, given that the state was the ultimate original owner of those lands. And I also know from other places in Flanders that this thing occurred. So my feeling is that it was much more common than is often thought, but it's not always easy. You have to have archive material really to prove it, right? And sometimes it's just not there.
It's a limitation.
Yeah, that's a limitation.
When there are no more questions, thanks again.